Audrey Munson's face is carved into New York itself, immortal in marble and bronze, adorning libraries, fountains, arches across Manhattan. The USS Maine Memorial in Central Park, the golden figure atop the Manhattan Municipal Building, the sculptures adorning the New York Public Library, dozens of monuments, maybe hundreds, all bearing her classical features that once defined American beauty itself. But Audrey Munson, the woman whose body became those monuments, died on February 20th, 1996, after spending 65 years locked in an asylum in Ogdensburg, New York. She was 104 years old. Her grave remained unmarked for 20 years. The obituaries, when they finally appeared, were brief and appeared in small print. Most people who read them had no idea they'd been walking past her immortal image their entire lives. Here's the cruelty at the heart of Audrey Munson's story. America made her a goddess in stone, carved her body into the very foundation of its greatest city, turned her into the physical embodiment of beauty, victory, and civic virtue. And then that same America destroyed her as a woman, shunned her, scandalized her, locked her away, and forgot her name while continuing to worship her image. She lived in two realities simultaneously. In one, she was immortal, the American Venus, frozen forever in classical perfection, her body representing everything noble and eternal about American civilization. In the other, she was mortal, fragile, broken, a woman who spent the last 6.5 decades of her life institutionalized, her name erased, her story buried while tourists took photographs of her face without knowing who she was. Was this the ultimate American tragedy? Or just the logical conclusion of a society that worships beauty but destroys the women who embody it? Audrey herself knew the answer. In 1921, before she disappeared into the asylum, she wrote, "America made me a goddess in marble and bronze, but as a woman they destroyed me." Another time, with even more devastating clarity, "I was beauty for everyone, but love for no one." And finally, the quote that would prove most prophetic, "They raised statues of me and buried me alive." The world loved Audrey Munson, the image, the perfect body, the classical face, the muse who made America's artistic ambitions tangible. But nobody knew how to love Audrey, the woman who would spend most of her life paying the price for daring to be both beautiful and visible. When she died in 1996, the art world barely noticed. The newspapers ran small obituaries. The city whose monuments bore her face said nothing. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery in upstate New York, far from the statues that had made her immortal. But to understand how Audrey Munson ended up spending 65 years in an asylum, we have to go back to the beginning, to 1891, to a working-class family in Rochester, New York, to a girl who would become America's first supermodel, and its most forgotten tragedy. 1891, Rochester, New York, a city of industry and immigrants where fortunes were made in photography and optics, where the future was being invented in workshops and factories. Audrey Marie Munson was born into this world not as a goddess, but as an ordinary girl, daughter of Edgar and Kitty Munson, a working-class couple with ordinary aspirations. Her childhood was unremarkable in the way most American childhoods were unremarkable. Neither wealthy enough to be pampered nor poor enough to be tragic. Her father worked various jobs. Her mother had dreams of something better. And Audrey grew up pretty but not yet beautiful, ordinary but not yet extraordinary. But something was different about Audrey even then. Friends and family recalled she had an unusual quality. Not just physical beauty, which would develop later, but a kind of ethereal presence, as if she existed slightly outside the normal world. She was dreamy, artistic, believed in romance and beauty with the kind of absolute faith that only the very young possess. When Audrey was around 8, her parents separated. Not unusual for the era, but destabilizing nonetheless. Her mother, Kitty, now a single parent, moved them to Providence, Rhode Island, trying to make a new start. But Providence offered no more opportunities than Rochester had. By the time Audrey was 15, Kitty had made a fateful decision. They would move to New York City, where beauty and ambition might actually mean something. 1906. Manhattan, a city being rebuilt from the ground up, where Beaux-Arts architecture was transforming the skyline, where the City Beautiful movement was creating monuments and public spaces that would define American civic identity for generations. This was a city hungry for beauty, for classical forms, for images that would legitimize America's place among the great civilizations. And into this world walked 15-year-old Audrey Munson, a girl from upstate New York with perfect classical features and no idea that she was about to become the physical embodiment of American artistic ambition. The discovery happened by chance, as these things often do. A photographer named Felix Benedict Herzog spotted Audrey walking down the street with her mother. He was struck by her face, not pretty in the conventional sense, but classical, as if she'd stepped out of a Greek temple. He approached Kitty and asked if Audrey would model for photographs. This moment would change everything. Not just for Audrey, but for American art itself. Because what Herzog recognized in that teenage girl wasn't just beauty. It was a face and body that perfectly embodied the classical ideals American artists were desperately trying to capture. Within months, Audrey was modeling for photographers and painters across the city. But it was sculptor Isidore Conti who truly discovered what she could be. He needed a model for a sculptural group he was creating, and Audrey's body, tall, perfectly proportioned, classically featured, was exactly what he'd been searching for. She posed for him in his studio and something clicked. This wasn't just modeling, this was art. Audrey's body, draped or nude, became the template for classical beauty. And in the early 1900s, when American sculpture was experiencing a renaissance, having the perfect model meant everything. Word spread quickly through New York's artistic community. This girl, this teenager, was the ideal muse. Her proportions were perfect, her features classical, her demeanor patient and professional. And most importantly, she understood something that many models didn't. She knew how to disappear into the art, to become not Audrey but beauty itself, virtue itself, victory itself. Could this early success have contained the seeds of later tragedy? Perhaps. Because Audrey learned young that her value lay not in who she was, but in what she represented. She was loved not as Audrey, but as America, as victory, as civic virtue. Her body belonged to the public. Her self became irrelevant. By 1913, when she was just 21, Audrey Munson had become the most famous artist model in America. She'd posed for dozens of the country's most important sculptors. Her body appeared on monuments being erected across the country, but especially in New York, where the City Beautiful movement was in full swing. The Panama Pacific Exposition of 1915 in San Francisco featured multiple sculptures using Audrey as the model. The main monument in Columbus Circle, dedicated in 1913, had Audrey's face and form representing Columbia triumphant. She was on buildings, bridges, monuments. Everywhere you looked in the new American landscape, there was Audrey. The press called her America's greatest artist's model, the American Venus, the queen of the artists' studios. She was famous, celebrated, her image ubiquitous. At 21, she'd achieved a kind of immortality most people never reach. But there was a problem, one that nobody seemed to notice or care about. Audrey was becoming an image rather than a person. She existed as beauty, as art, as symbol. But as a woman? As a human being with needs and desires and a future? Nobody was thinking about that. Not the artists who used her, not the public who admired her, not even Audrey herself, who believed with absolute faith that beauty was noble, that art was sacred, that her body was a gift to be shared with the world. She had no idea that the same society worshipping her in bronze and marble was preparing to destroy her in flesh and blood. The pedestal was already being built. And pedestals, as Audrey would learn, are just another kind of cage, Beautiful from a distance, but impossible to escape once you're placed on top. The transformation from goddess to prisoner was about to begin, 1915. The year everything changed, though Audrey didn't know it yet. She was 24 years old at the absolute peak of her fame and beauty, her face and body so ubiquitous in American art that she'd become synonymous with classical beauty itself. And that year she made a decision that would ultimately destroy her. She appeared in a motion picture called Inspiration. The film was revolutionary for its time. A drama about an artist's model that featured actual nudity, presented as artistic rather than titillating. Audrey appeared nude in several scenes, her body filmed in the same classical poses she'd held for sculptors. The filmmakers marketed it as high art, as bringing sculpture to life, as proof that cinema could be as elevated as any other artistic medium. Behind all that artistic rhetoric, was there a naive belief that society would see it the same way? Audrey believed absolutely that nudity in service of art was noble, pure, beyond reproach. She'd been posing nude for sculptors for years, and those sculptures were celebrated, placed in public squares, admired by everyone. Why would film be different? But film was different, terribly, devastatingly different. Because sculpture was cold, distant, immortal, you could admire a nude marble statue without acknowledging the actual naked woman who'd posed for it. But film was warm, moving, alive. Watching Audrey move naked on screen, audiences couldn't maintain the comfortable fiction that this was just art. They were forced to confront the reality. This was an actual woman, naked, visible, real. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Churches denounced the film. Moral crusaders called for it to be banned. Newspapers that had celebrated America's Venus when she was safely frozen in stone suddenly called her shameless, immoral, a corrupting influence on American youth. Audrey was devastated. She'd believed, truly believed, that her body in service of art was noble. She'd spent years being told she was beauty itself, that her classical form was elevating American culture. And now those same voices were calling her a disgrace. But worse was coming. Much worse. Because while the controversy over Inspiration was still raging, Audrey became entangled in a scandal that would finish the destruction the film had started. She was living as a boarder with a doctor named Walter Wilkins and his wife. It was a respectable arrangement, or should have been. But Dr. Wilkins had become obsessed with Audrey. Not unusual, given that half of New York's artistic community was obsessed with her. But Wilkins's obsession was different, darker, more possessive. In February 1919, Dr. Wilkins murdered his wife. The crime was brutal, calculated, and when he was arrested, the press immediately made the connection. Audrey Munson, America's Venus, had been living in his house. The newspapers went insane. Headlines screamed about the artist's model murder. They implied, without ever quite stating directly, that Audrey had been involved with Wilkins, that she'd driven him to murder, that her beauty had somehow caused this tragedy. Never mind that there was no evidence of any romantic relationship. Never mind that Audrey was as much a victim as anyone. The narrative was too perfect to resist. The beautiful model as femme fatale, driving men to madness and murder. Did this tragic event mark her downfall? Or was it simply revealing what had always been true? That America's love for Audrey Munson was conditional. That it existed only as long as she remained a perfect image rather than a complicated human being. The moment she became associated with scandal, with sexuality, with anything messy or real, that love evaporated. Audrey was never charged with any crime. She was innocent. But innocence meant nothing. The press had decided she was guilty, guilty of being too beautiful, too visible, too much herself rather than the sanitized image people wanted. Work dried up immediately. Sculptors who'd fought to have her model for them suddenly had full schedules. Photographers stopped calling. The woman whose face adorned half of Manhattan couldn't get a job. She tried to defend herself. In interviews, she explained that she'd only ever wanted to serve art, that her nudity had been in service of beauty, that she'd never done anything shameful. But her explanations only made things worse. A woman defending herself was proof of guilt. A woman insisting on her own narrative was unseemly. By 1920, Audrey Munson was unemployable. The American Venus had become an outcast. She was 29 years old and her career was over. But the tragedy was just beginning. 1920, 1931. The Descent. These were the years when Audrey Munson went from celebrated goddess to forgotten ghost, from the woman whose body represented American ideals to a mentally ill woman nobody wanted to acknowledge. She tried everything to resurrect her career. She wrote articles for newspapers about her life as a model, trying to control her own narrative. In one heartbreaking piece from 1921, she wrote, "The American Venus has no home, no peace." It read like prophecy, like she already knew what was coming. She attempted to become an actress, appearing in a few more films, but the scandal had poisoned everything. Audiences couldn't see past the headlines. Producers didn't want the controversy. Each attempt failed more miserably than the last. The money ran out. Audrey and her mother, Kitty, who'd been living on Audrey's modeling income, found themselves destitute. The woman who'd been photographed in diamonds and silk was living in shabby boarding houses, struggling to pay rent. Friends from her modeling days disappeared. The artists who'd made their careers on her body wanted nothing to do with the actual woman. When she walked past the monuments bearing her face, and she must have, living in New York, did anyone recognize her? Did anyone care? The psychological toll was devastating. Audrey, who'd built her entire identity on being beauty, on serving art, on believing that her body was a noble gift, had been rejected by the very people she'd given everything to. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. She'd done exactly what society told her to do, be beautiful, serve artists, elevate culture, and she'd been destroyed for it. She started showing signs of mental illness. Depression, certainly. Paranoia, possibly. She believed people were following her, that conspiracies were working against her. Were they delusions or just accurate readings of a society that had indeed turned against her? The line between paranoia and reality becomes very thin when the world actually is treating you cruelly. By the late 1920s, her behavior had become erratic enough that her mother couldn't cope. Kitty, who'd pushed Audrey into modeling, who'd profited from her daughter's beauty, who'd believed that Audrey's body was their ticket to a better life, now faced the consequences of those decisions. In 1931, Kitty made a choice that would define the rest of Audrey's life. She had her daughter committed to an asylum, St. Lawrence State Hospital in Ogdensburg, New York, a psychiatric institution far from Manhattan, far from the monuments that bore Audrey's face, far from anyone who might remember or care who she'd been. Audrey Munson was 40 years old when the asylum doors closed behind her. She would never leave. She would spend the next 65 years locked inside, her name forgotten, her story erased, while the statues she'd modeled for continued to stand in New York, worshipped and photographed by people who had no idea who she was. Were these final decisions acts of surrender? Or was commitment the only option left in a society that had no place for a woman like Audrey? She wasn't young enough to model anymore. She wasn't rich enough to live independently. She wasn't healthy enough mentally to navigate a world that had brutally rejected her. The asylum was where America put women it didn't know what to do with. Women who'd been used up, broken down, rendered inconvenient. The American Venus had been buried alive just as she'd predicted, and the burial would last 65 years, 1931, 1996. 65 years. That's how long Audrey Munson spent locked in St. Lawrence State Hospital. 65 years of institutional walls, of locked doors, of being patient 11-4-11, of being nobody to people who'd never heard the name American Venus and wouldn't have cared if they had. What do you do with 65 years in an asylum? How do you mark the passage of that much time when every day is identical, when the world outside moves on without you, when everyone who knew who you were gradually dies or forgets? We know almost nothing about Audrey's life during those decades. Psychiatric records from that era are sparse, and patient privacy laws mean what does exist is sealed. But we can piece together fragments from the few people who saw her, from records that did survive, from the simple fact of her continued existence. She lived quietly, too quietly for someone who'd once been famous. She was, by all accounts, a model patient, gentle, cooperative, withdrawn. The fire that had driven her to model, to act, to defend herself in the press had been extinguished. Or perhaps just buried so deep that it couldn't reach the surface anymore. Did she remember who she'd been? Did she think about the statues, the films, the days when her face represented America itself? Or had those memories become unreal, like dreams from someone else's life? The world outside changed dramatically during her imprisonment. The 1930s Depression, World War II, the 1950s boom, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the women's movement. The entire shape of American society transformed, and Audrey experienced none of it except as distant echoes in an institution that existed outside of time. The statues remained. In fact, they multiplied. Buildings and monuments created in the 1910s and 1920s with Audrey's body as the model became landmarks, tourist destinations, Instagram backgrounds. Millions of people photographed themselves in front of Audrey's immortal face. Not one of them knew her name. Occasionally, very occasionally, someone would remember. An art historian researching Beaux-Arts sculpture, a journalist working on a story about early American cinema. They dig through archives, find references to Audrey Munson, artist's model, and maybe try to track down what happened to her. If they were persistent enough, they'd discover she was still alive, still institutionalized. But what could they do with that information? Visit a 90-year-old woman in an asylum and ask about modeling she'd done 70 years ago? Write a story nobody would read about a forgotten model? The American public had moved on. Audrey's story belonged to a different era, one that felt as distant as ancient Rome. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Audrey, there was no escape because there was no exit. The asylum was her world, complete and total. The shadows from 1919, the scandal, the shunning, the destruction of her life, had solidified into walls that would contain her until death. She aged in that institution. 40 became 50, became 60, became 70. Her beauty, which had once stopped traffic and inspired artists, faded in the way all beauty fades, but with no one watching, no one caring. The face that had represented eternal youth in marble grew old in fluorescent-lit corridors. By the 1980s, Audrey was in her 90s, one of the asylum's longest-term patients. The staff who cared for her had no idea about her history. To them, she was just another elderly patient, quiet and undemanding. Someone who'd been there longer than anyone could remember. Sometimes, in the early years of her confinement, she'd been allowed supervised walks in town. Did she ever pass store windows displaying magazines, newspapers featuring photographs of New York monuments? Did she see her own face carved in stone looking back at her from the pages unrecognized? The woman in the asylum and the goddess in the monument had become so separate that they might as well have been different people entirely. She reached her 100th birthday in 1991. In most places, reaching 100 is cause for celebration. Local newspapers, maybe a visit from the mayor, certainly recognition from the community. But Audrey's centenary passed unmarked. The asylum may have acknowledged it internally, but there were no news stories, no celebrations. Why would there be? Nobody remembered who she was. Nobody knew that the quiet old woman in room 411 had once been the most famous artist's model in America. 5 more years passed. Audrey turned 104, an extraordinary age, but longevity loses its meaning when you've spent 65 of those years locked away from the world. And on February 20th, 1996, her heart finally stopped. The woman whose body had been immortalized in marble and bronze, whose face had represented American ideals for generations, died alone in a psychiatric institution, her name forgotten by everyone except a handful of historians and the bureaucrats who processed her death certificate. There was no funeral worth noting, no memorial service, no gathering of admirers or artistic community. The newspapers that had once called her America's greatest artists model ran brief obituaries buried in back pages. Most didn't run anything at all. She was buried in an unmarked grave in New Haven Cemetery in Ogdensburg. No headstone bore her name. No marker indicated that America's Venus rested there. Just an anonymous plot in upstate New York, as far from the monuments of Manhattan as you could get while staying in the same state. The woman had died as invisibly as she'd lived for 65 years. But the statues? They stood exactly as they had, immortal and unchanging, worshipped by a city that had no idea who they were looking at. 1996 present. The afterlife of a ghost. While Audrey Munson died forgotten, her image continues to watch over New York City, more visible and celebrated than ever, her story finally being told by people who weren't alive when she was buried in obscurity. Walk through Manhattan today and you'll encounter Audrey dozens of times without knowing it. The golden figure atop the Manhattan Municipal Building, visible for miles. That's Audrey. The allegorical sculptures on the New York Public Library. Audrey. The figures adorning the Pulitzer Fountain at Grand Plaza. Audrey. The Washington Square Arch, the Hall of Records, dozens of other landmarks and monuments, all Audrey, all immortal, all famous. Tourists photograph these sculptures daily. Instagram influencers pose in front of them. Architecture tours point them out as examples of Beaux-Arts excellence. The statues have become so iconic that they're synonymous with New York itself. They represent civic pride, classical beauty, American civilization at its height. But nobody knows her name. Ask 100 people posing in front of the Manhattan Municipal Building who the golden figure represents, and maybe one will know it's supposed to be civic fame. Ask who modeled for it, and you'll get blank stares. Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? Not in the conspiratorial sense, but something systemic, something darker. Audrey Munson was destroyed by a society that worshipped female beauty in the abstract while punishing actual women for embodying it. She was turned into art, into symbol, into image, and when the living woman became inconvenient, messy, associated with scandal, she was quietly removed from public life and forgotten. In recent years, there's been growing interest in Audrey's story. Books have been written. James Bone's American Venus in 2016 brought her story to a wider audience. Documentaries have been produced. Art historians and feminists have begun examining her life as a case study in how American society consumed and discarded women. Some have tried to reclaim her as a feminist icon, a woman who dared to use her body on her own terms and was punished for it. Others argue she was a victim of exploitation, pushed into modeling by an ambitious mother and used by artists who cared more about her body than her humanity. Both interpretations have truth to them. Audrey was neither purely agent nor purely victim. She was a woman trying to navigate a society that had very narrow ideas about what beautiful women could be. The cruel irony is impossible to ignore. Audrey Munson is more famous now, more celebrated than she was in the final 70 years of her life. Her statues have become tourist attractions. Her films have been digitally restored and shown at museums. Her story is taught in art history classes as an example of the model-muse relationship in American sculpture. But all of this recognition came too late. She spent 65 years institutionalized, forgotten, erased. She died without knowing that people would eventually care about her story, that historians would fight to recover her narrative, that her name would be remembered. In 2016, after decades of her grave remaining unmarked, a headstone was finally placed at her burial site. It reads, Audrey Munson, 1891-1996, America's first supermodel. The phrase is meant to honor her, but there's something reductive about it, turning a complex, tragic life into a marketing slogan, branding her even in death. America's first supermodel captures none of the tragedy, none of the 65 years of imprisonment, none of the brutal irony of dying forgotten while remaining immortal. It's just another way of making her into image rather than acknowledging her as a person who suffered. Today, when art students study early American sculpture, they learn about Audrey Munson. When film historians discuss early cinema and nudity, they reference inspiration. When feminists analyze the treatment of women in early 20th century America, Audrey's story appears as evidence. But here's what they don't teach, what the plaques beside the statues don't mention. Audrey Munson spent most of her life buried alive in an asylum, locked away by the same society that had turned her into a goddess. They don't mention that she died alone, forgotten, in a psychiatric institution after 65 years of imprisonment. The lesson of Audrey Munson's life is devastating in its clarity. America will immortalize your body while destroying your soul. It will carve you into monuments while erasing you as a person. It will worship the image and discard the woman. And it will do all of this while claiming to honor you, to elevate you, to make you immortal. The statues will outlast us all. They'll stand for centuries, classical and perfect and utterly inhuman. Tourists will continue photographing them, admiring them, using them as backdrops for their own moments of beauty and joy. And Audrey Munson, the actual woman who stood for hours in cold studios, who believed in the nobility of art, who gave her body to American sculpture and received nothing in return except scandal and imprisonment. She remains buried in an unmarked grave in upstate New York, her story known only to those who bother to look past the marble to find the flesh underneath. So we're left with questions that indict an entire culture. When society immortalizes a woman's body in stone but erases her name in life, are we honoring beauty or committing violence against the human being beneath it? Is there something inherently brutal in the way we consume female beauty, worshipping it in marble while discarding the women who embody it? And perhaps the most damning question, how many other Audrey Munsons are there? Women turned into eternal images while their real lives were buried alive in silence. Women whose bodies we still admire in museums and monuments while their names have been erased from history, their suffering forgotten, their humanity denied. The monuments will keep standing. The statues will keep being photographed. Millions will continue to walk past Audrey's face without knowing who she was, what she endured, how she died. The image, that perfect, classical, immortal image, will outlive us all. But Audrey Munson, the woman, the one who said, "They raised statues of me and buried me alive," was right about everything. In the end, America got exactly what it wanted from her: beauty without humanity, perfection without complexity, art without the inconvenience of the artist. They carved her into stone and bronze, turned her into monuments that would last forever. And then they locked the real woman away for 65 years until she died, alone and forgotten, in an asylum far from the city that had made her immortal. The statues are still there, immortal and unchanging. But Audrey Munson, the woman, disappeared the moment she was turned into stone, the moment her body became public property, the moment America decided she was more valuable as a symbol than as a human being. They raised statues of her, and they buried her alive. And the statues will outlast us all, beautiful and cold and utterly inhuman, while the woman they were modeled after remains buried in an unmarked grave, her suffering forgotten, her humanity erased by the very immortality that was supposed to honor her.